we still as adults at this very moment operate according to fantasies, some which were created in childhood, some which we are currently created. Secondly, because developmental maturity in some important areas of life, at least, is rarely fully achieved. For a number of negative reasons, immature, irrational, and non-rational fantasies may continue to dominate our lives as people. We rarely develop in a fully whole sense of the word. Despite our advancement in a number of areas of our lives and our maturity in a number of areas of our lives, we can all find some infantileness somewhere in our personalities, where we have, in a sense, been fixated by various experiences. When this is the case, that is, when childish, wish-fulfilling fantasies predominate in the adult consciousness, then there's relatively little inadequate or maladaptive growth in the affected areas of human behavior. That is, then, in those areas where we suffer a great deal, we will also find retarded growth in our human potentials in those areas, a stunting of our human potential, and an impoverishment of our personalities and of our possibilities. Although there are a number of fantasies and a number of ways fantasies serve positively and negatively in our lives, my primary concern here is with what I would call compensatory fantasies. Because I believe it is these types of fantasies, these fantasies that we create to compensate for our psychological pain and our psychological and social deprivations, which retard and addle our natural genius as a people. In psychology, fantasy is listed as one of the so-called ego defense mechanisms, the mental and behavioral means by which we use to defend ourselves against threat, against stress, and the means by which we seek to alleviate our anxiety and our fears. The interesting thing about these so-called ego defense mechanisms is the means by which they achieve these ends. These objectives are achieved mainly by our denial and distortion of reality, by our deceiving ourselves, lying to ourselves about some aspect of reality. We gain then relief from our psychological pain and our social suffering and our deprivation. We protect our fragile ego and our fragile self-esteem. Unfortunately, too often we protect it, though, through self-deception, through denying the real, and through not coming to terms with reality and seeking to solve the problems that the reality confronts us with. This can happen so often until we become addicted to self-deception and addicted to the distortion and denial of reality, which further then encumbers our capacity to deal with reality to the point that we are often then victimized by it, if not outright destroyed by the forces it represents. We utilize ego defense mechanisms because they conveniently and often effectively soften our failures, reduce conflicting thoughts, feelings, and emotions, alleviate anxiety, repair emotional injuries, and help us to maintain our feelings of competence and worth. However, we pay a dear price for these convenient psychological pain relievers, tranquilizers, and morale boosters, when the reality denial and distortion and the self-deception they operationally require prevent us from realistically coping with our problems, impairs our ability to resolve very important problems, and leads to self-defeating and self-destructive behavior. As defined by Coleman in this book, The Psychology and Effective Behavior, fantasy not only is used to screen out unpleasant aspects of reality, but we also tend to use fantasy to picture things as we would like them to be. Fantasy is stimulated by frustrated desires and grows out of mental images associated with need gratification. In fantasy, the person achieves his goals and meets his needs in his imagination, though not in reality. Coleman describes an essential aspect of what I call compensatory fantasy, that kind of fantasy that is built around magical, imaginative thinking and make-believe behavior designed to disguise or counterbalance our perceived weaknesses and our undesirable traits by emphasizing or developing substitute thoughts and behavioral tendencies and characteristics which make up for those so-called weaknesses and make up for those characteristics that we see as undesirable. In other words, often then fantasies are substitutes for action, but fantasy is not only those things lived in the mind and lived in the imagination. Fantasy is acted out in the behavior of people as well. Compensatory fantasy then is not only thought out in imagination and daydreamed, but is also acted out through everyday ongoing behavior. And whether thought out or acted out, imagined or interacted, the important thing to know about compensatory fantasy is that it results from wounds, from injuries to our egos, from constraints, from pain, from feelings of inadequacy and inferiority. And these injuries, confinements, and feelings may occur early in life, and their resultant compensatory fantasies achieve the status of prolonged or lifelong directive forces, overwhelming obsessions, delusions, and articles of faith. What am I indicating here? I'm indicating that our early pains and social deprivations, the wounds to our egos, our separations from our African selves and our African consciousness and identity, from our African culture, the wounds visited on our egos by the scandalizing of our character as a people by the white supremacist establishment, often provokes us to engage in compensatory fantasies and imaginings and behavior. And these reactionary fantasies often become lifelong forces in our minds and in our bodies and continue to shape our behavior literally from the cradle to the grave. Not only then as individuals, but also as a people. Consequently, they become instruments, modes of perceiving reality. In other words, the reactionary and compensatory fantasies that we evoke in order to soothe our pain often then transforms our vision and transforms our perception of reality and of ourselves. They then engage us in futile and vain attempts to translate hard reality into fantasy images. And as pathological reactions to pathological experiences, the enactment of these reactionary fantasies, their acting out become psychological sickness or psychopathology, or more benignly, psychological, social, mental underdevelopment. The internalized mythologies of white supremacy and the injuries it visits upon our collective ego as African people, the constraints and restrictions it places on our potentials and possibilities, along with our reactionary defensive posturings in response to these attacks and shacklings of our humanity, give rise and sustenance to the self-defeating, self-destructive, unliberating, anti-growth fantasies which characterizes too much of our lives today. These compensatory fantasies may assume various forms, and there are many forms that are prevalent today in the African American community. And in the light of our time, do not have time to go through many of them, but a few I will mention. One, of course, I will call the assimilationist fantasy. In this fantasy, we surrender our identity and culture in order to merge with the alleged superior whites, to incorporate ourselves in whites so as to achieve the illusion of omnipotence, wholeness, and completeness, to inflate our wounded egos through incorporation and through surrender and becoming one with our godlike ideal, the white supremacist male. This fantasy feeds the need for the wounded African to feel whole and connected, to feel omnipotent, fulfilled, loved, embraced, and encompassed. And we see this kind of fantasy operating in the very Supreme Court decisions that we celebrate so much. In the 1954 Supreme Court decision that was in part based on the idea that African children must assimilate with white children and African people must assimilate with European people and must assimilate with their enemies if they were come to perceive themselves as fully human and as whole human beings. And that African man and African woman and child is not complete until they are loved and accepted by their exploiters and abusers. And we have seen a whole generation of African people and African leadership pursue this fantasy and try to turn the whole hard nature of racist reality into the fantasy images of assimilation. This fantasy, as we should have known from the start, was doomed to failure. The very foundation and domination is founded on maintaining the subordination of African people. It was founded on the colonizing and the enslavement of African people. And therefore, for us to merge with it, if it were even possible, would mean that what we are seeking to merge with would have evaporated, because its very nature is founded upon our subordination as a people. And in order for the whites to maintain their system that we admire so much, they have to maintain their domination of us as a folk, making then our fantasy-like assimilation with them an impossibility. Another fantasy I call the retreatist or escapist fantasy. In this instance, the white mythological stereotypes of blacks are internalized and identified with by us. And for many of us, then, the value ideals of white society and Eurocentric society are inverted and perverted. This Fantasy, so prevalent in many of our youth today, includes the pursuit of immediate short-sighted gratification, obsessions with music, clothes, outrageous mannerisms. It identifies freedom with consumption of faddish and luxury items, with wanton sexuality, pointless socializing, the ingestion of euphoriants, sedatives, and other painkillers, malt liquor, beer, and whiskey, the driving of fast, sporty cars, and the obsessive watching of televised ball games and violent dramas. This fantasy, too, is doomed to ultimate failure for reasons that should be all too obvious. So you're not going to challenge European man. And I see the cowardice on these subway trains as I ride every day, as young men and young black men have given up their prerogatives as males, which is to challenge the white male and to destroy his dominance in this world, where young men have lost faith in their genius and in their capacities as warriors and in their capacities to do for self, and retreated into a bobbing of heads to music all day and all night long, and into being hypnotized by rhythm and rap, and into a culture of sadomasochism. We see too many now crawled up into themselves, caught up in fantasies of having buku women, making great rap rhymes and big money and throwing balls at hoops and running into each other on football fields and singing and therefore achieving something in life while leaving the people behind and leaving African people enshackled by European dominance. A third fantasy I refer to sort of as the transcendental fantasy. It is also retreatist and escapist. This fantasy involves making oneself sufficient unto itself, abstracting oneself to become spirit, disembodied mind, becoming so perfect in body and mind and spirit as to become invulnerable to the everyday struggles and crises of life, to transcend and be above the everyday struggles of our people. A fantasy that's caught up in hope, in keeping hope alive, the hope for social and psychological change of white supremacists, the hope that through some spiritual or supernatural intervention, our oppression will end either with our own supremacy or incorporation in some egalitarian brotherhood of man. So we see so many of those thinking if they only eat right, pray right, meditate right, and all these other things, the great millennium will occur. The whole great millennium is going to occur because you're knocking your head on the floor, because you are mumbling some mantra, or you are calling out on Jesus Christ and all the rest of these jokers you call God. Change occurs through the very concrete activity of man with man and man against man. And you cannot escape as long as you are imprisoned and encapsulated in something called the human body, the problems of this world and the pains it brings to people who live in it. So the idea that you are somehow going to find some beatific state, some God consciousness that would allow you to escape from the realities of the African world is also doomed to failure as well. It means as long as you're caught up in these apocalyptic and eschatological kinds of fantasies, the longer our people remain oppressed. And the more difficult it is for you to achieve even your own desired spirituality. Because nothing is as dispiriting as is oppression. Generally, then, fantasy constructions are formed under the pressure of strong feelings and by defenses aimed to deal with conflicts inherent in psychological growth. The internal impetus to create a fantasy, whether expressed overtly or covertly, to the person's efforts in this way, refer to the person's efforts in this way to alter intolerable limitations and frustrations in the reality situation, or defend himself against the anxieties aroused by aggressive conflicts. But there are other types of fantasies, and that you can see when I talk about fantasies and mythologies. I am not talking about them solely as negative forces, but fantasies can be very positive forces in life. Particularly when those fantasies motivate us to actively engage life itself, to actually adapt to the requirements of reality and to adapt reality to our own requirements in realistic terms, and to achieve mastery by our creative activity and our capacity to cooperate together as men and women and as a people. Fantasies then may be healthy in the sense that they serve as symbols which seek a clear and definite goal. They strive to distinguish or lay hold of a certain line of future psychological, social, political, and economic development. The fantasy, as some would call it, of African nation building, of the development of a global African political and economic system, the fantasy of bringing into reality the fruition of a Pan-African world, is that kind of fantasy that elevates intelligence, that places demands on intelligence, that transforms our relationships one with the other in such a way as to stimulate the very best that is within us as people. It lays down worthy goals, and it instructs us as to how we should develop our character and develop ourselves as individuals, as people, as communities, as nations, to achieve those goals. It means then that we will establish an African-centered education, an African-centered form of socialization of our children. Because at the center of an African-centered education, of course, is the advancement of the interests of African people, of providing for the future security of African people and enhancing the quality of life of African people. And in achieving these goals, overthrowing white supremacy and overthrowing or retarding or preventing the incursion of other ethnic groups who would destroy our autonomy and our liberty as people. When we set these goals as the major aims of our people, and when we set their achievement as the major problems to be solved by our people, then these problems will help to shape the character of our minds and the character of our behavior as people. They will shape the experiences that we provide for our children. They will shape their intelligence. We will ask ourselves, in accordance to these problems, to these goals and to these values, what kind of people must we become in order to bring our dreams into reality and to achieve the goals we must achieve if we are to survive as people? What kind of institutions must we build and operate if we're to become the kinds of people we must become. What kinds of social experiences and educational experiences must we provide our children so that they may become the adults we need them to become in order to achieve the goals we need to achieve? And when should these experiences occur in the lives of our children so that they may maximize their potentials and their natural genius? You see, a theory of African-centered education matches the educational and socializing experiences of our children with their developmental milestones, which we have shown earlier are unique to themselves. And therefore, an African-centered education is based on the developmental psychology of African children, is founded on the psychological history of African people, and is designed to fulfill the needs for bringing into reality our African destiny as a people. If we are to achieve these things, then we must confront our fears. We must control our reaction to these fears in ways that promote our development rather than retard them. We must lose our fear of knowledge, which to a great extent is based on our fear of ourselves. Our fear of knowing, our fears of knowing reality, of probing reality, of mastering reality, even being at one with it and in harmony with it, is connected to our fears of getting to know ourselves, who we are, what we are. We can understand that because the stereotyping of ourselves by the white supremacist establishment has associated what we think of as ourselves and our African heritage with fearful images, fearful experiences, and therefore we shrink from them. We have been given the white culture and white people as ego ideals, and therefore too many of us have striven to imitate those ideals, as I said earlier, to merge with those ideas, which then has forced us to reject and throw away our African identity and consciousness and ideals. And we can all the more reject these ideals if they are associated with unpleasant experiences, unpleasant symbols, and other things. We then move away from ourselves in terms of fear. And our lives then are not determined by positive motives, but by negative motives, the negative motives of avoidance and escape. We must then come forthrightly to confront our own selves, our own emotion, impulses, memories, capacities, potentialities, and our destiny as a people. We must confront our fear of getting to know ourselves, to master ourselves, and ultimately to master our universe. This fear of knowledge, which to a good extent is related to the underdevelopment of our intellectual capacities, is derivative of our need to defend ourselves from overexposure to degrading experiences, to knowledge that could cause us not to feel good about ourselves, to feel inferior, and to feel shameful. Our fear of knowledge, of failure, our avoidance of the pains and dangers of knowing retards our range of growth as persons and as a people, and prevents us from discovering and developing our best side, our talents, highest potentials, and creativeness. Even in discovering them, we may deny them and struggle against our own greatness. Certainly the challenging of the Eurocentric political economic behemoth and monster, certainly making a commitment to the overthrow of white supremacy, certainly the development of African people to be a people among people, to be the equals or superiors to not only the Europeans, but to the Japanese and to any other ethnic group on this earth, must fill us with a bit of fear. But we must face that fear. We must embrace it. We must overcome it. We must see that we are bigger than it. And in recognizing this fear, we unleash our potential as people on all fronts. And we then begin to crystallize and bring into reality the natural genius that is ours. The mythologies of white supremacy has made too many of us feel that knowledge and techniques are things reserved for a few special people, especially for whites, for the gods. We note this when we witness our youth chiding their peers for their acting like white boys, nerds, fags, when some of them may show a penchant for reading, studying, pursuing academic excellence, for pursuing knowledge. In this instance, then, our youth become allies to our oppressors, and in a sense, preempt the oppressors' crushing of our spirit and of our genius by their own infantile and youthful depredations. This idea that knowledge and the power which comes from knowledge is reserved for whites or Japanese or Chinese or others is demonstrated in our fear to be godlike as people. It reflects our internalization of the white man's perception of the black man's pursuit and mastery of knowledge as a form of anti-white aggression, as insubordination and insurrection. Too many of us perhaps remember when to be a smart nigger, to be an uppity nigger, was a prelude to being lynched. Too many of us then have learned that lesson so well, and in a way have forgotten it and pushed it into our subconscious until we ourselves now dislike a smart nigger and want to lynch him. However, if we are to overcome, we must confront and overcome our fears of the dangers and responsibilities and duties that come with the discovery and development of our great talents. We must reject out of hand our Eurocentrically conditioned tendency to identify intelligence and whiteness, to feel that to probe, to search, to be curious, to affirm, to discover, and to use knowledge and technique, to feel as if it is emasculating, as defeminizing, as non-black. We must also lose our fear that in challenging our oppressors, in tenaciously developing our intelligence and searching out the truth, in boldly asserting ourselves in areas once thought the exclusive preserve of white males, will bring down their wrath on our heads. We must face that this is a battle to the death. We will not be saved by retreat and by escape. I find it tragic as I move across university campuses what little lack of knowledge our students have of what is really occurring in this world, and how in the pursuit of their degrees they are chasing a world that no longer exists, and how we have a community filled with motivators who tell our people that they can be what they want to be. Dare to live your dream, which is often nothing but the American dream, without recognizing that these dreams and these darings can only be realized within a particular kind of social and political structure. That one just does not make success by merely dreaming. There must exist a social system in which this success is to occur. And the dreams that too many of our people are trying to live are no longer founded on social reality. The tremendous political and economical restructurings that are going on in this world will boggle your mind. If you look at what is going on in this country and in the world, you will recognize that we as African people are face to face with obsolescence and possible destruction. I wish I had time to talk to you today about a subject matter that I will cover in the book on power, about the things that are going on in the U.S. economy and in the world economy, where workers now are defined as disposable, where workers are called contingent workers, where workers will be leased from one company to the other, where the re-engineering of the workplace implies that this nation may have to rid itself of some 25 million jobs in an economy of 90 million employed people. You must recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that the ultimate goal of capitalism is not employment, but unemployment. The ideal capitalist structure, which strives for efficiency, and efficiency as simply defined as doing the most with what? The least. Ultimately means then, in the glory land of capitalism, there will not be one person working or employed, and yet the system will continue to do what? Produce. This is where capitalism inherently moves toward. Not necessarily the expansion of employment, but it's shrinking. This is one of the reasons why then you hear about downsizing, shrinking the workforce, automation, re-engineering, virtual corporations, and all of these other things that are occurring, such that there has been a tremendous increase in the productivity of this country without a corresponding increase in the employment of people. And this is the kind of recession from which this nation is seeking to recover. That for the first time in this history, so-called white-collar workers and middle management workers are being put out to pasture. For in this history now, this country is importing Asian engineers and firing not black engineers, because there are not that many, white engineers. Where its engineering work and its research and development work is being shipped out to other nations and other people. We must recognize then the danger that we confront as African American people. But then, on the whole, the African continent is in a similar position. As a matter of fact, the conditions of African people in America parallel the conditions of African people the world over. And if African people are becoming obsolete and useless in the American social and political and economic system, African people in the world are becoming obsolete in a world economy. And as that world economy grows, and as it demands more resources, we will not see other nations sit and watch what they view as useless Africans and obsolete Africans, whether in America or in the African continent or in the African diaspora itself. They will not sit by and see us occupy valuable space and land any more than they were prepared to sit by and watch the Native American occupy valuable land. When those Arabs in North Africa run up against the scarcity of water, they are not going to hesitate to go right into sub-Saharan Africa to gain Lebensraum, a living room for their own populations. And I don't care if you're a Muslim, because there's a difference between being an Arab and a Muslim. And when people are up against the wall and they need additional resources and water and other vital resources, whether you belong to the same church and sit in the same pew will not matter. If you have it, they will take it. If you have not the means to defend yourself and have not the means to protect your own survival as a people, we will then be counted as one of the races that used to be. That means then we must transform our fantasies. We must transform our mythologies. And in doing so, transform our genius. We must rid ourselves of the pseudo-stupidity that is often used by exploited and downtrodden and weak minorities as forms of self-defense and self-preservation. We cannot any longer hide behind dumbness as a means of protecting ourselves from the blows of white supremacy. In protecting his prerogatives and his supremacy, the white man has made too many of us perceive knowledge as dangerous and as incompatible with being a good, nice, well-adjusted black subordinate. Besides gaining the power knowledge brings and the liberation from ignorance and oppression it makes possible, to pursuit of knowledge and understanding provide their own reward, the reward of sheer delight and primordial satisfaction. They make us all the wiser, richer, stronger, more evolved, enlightened, and more mature, and moves us toward the actualization of our human potential as an African people.